upcoming agenda in terms of planning actions that will be presented before them. I also noted that 231 Granite Street was appealed, and as such, that will be presented to the City Council for their consideration on an on-the-record appeal on June 17th, I believe.
It's 231 Charlie's place, the Hamilton, what? Oh, all the way, okay, thank you. Advisory committee or liaisons? No.
And no reports.
There's no one here to speak, so, or I'm assuming that nobody that's online is here to speak either.
The individuals online are consultants and Commissioner Perkinson.
Right, well, I recognize him. Okay, then. Discussion items is the walkable design standards. And Eric's here, good.
I think you're all intimately familiar with the climate-friendly and equitable communities rules. The walkable design standards are the latest in those, requiring that the city adopt walkable design standards citywide prior to our TSP adoption. And we're have been working with Cascadia Consultants for seems like 5 years now, so probably the last 9 months, to prepare walkable design standards, both to implement the state walkable design requirements and to consider some potential changes that aren't required but that might be helpful to the code. So I think we have Pauline Ruegg and Jamin Kimmel here tonight to give a presentation and talk about those standards.
Great.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. We are excited to be here, and just give me a minute to get set up here. I'm showing you the right thing. Great. Well, look forward to our opportunity to speak with you this evening. Just want to walk through this. And actually, I'm sorry, give me a minute. Yeah, this is the correct presentation. Okay, I'm sorry. This is the presentation that we showed to you last time. So I'm not going to show you that. I'm going to show you a more up-to-date presentation. Sorry about that. Here we go. All right. Great. I'll get us back on track here. Great. So we met with you a while back. So this is who we are again. Presenting. Yes. Presenting. Can you all see my screen? No.
No.
Nope. Okay. Gosh, sorry guys.
Do you have to get every yeah.
All right. Okay. Can you see the screen now? Okay, great. I apologize. I had a great weekend camping on the John Day River, and it appears to have fried my ability to do a screen share. So thanks for sticking with me. All right, well, we're gonna walk you through this today. So I wanna provide just a quick reminder of the project. We spoke with you a while back, so just wanna give a quick refresh. We've done a round of stakeholder outreach, including we met with City Council, and we wanna share what they had to say about this project. After I walk you through all of that, I'm just gonna pause, see if there's any questions or comments. And then we're going to spend the majority of the time walking through the code concepts, and we'll pause after each one of those for discussion. So that's where we're headed tonight. As a reminder, CFEC is an overall large set of regulations from the state looking at climate, transportation, and equity. We're focusing specifically in this project on the portion of the rules, which is 0330, which is related to land use regulations. And so that portion of the rules is focused on requiring jurisdictions to regulate land use to support compact, pedestrian-friendly, mixed-use land use development patterns. So that we've really just boiled down to walkable design. That's our moniker for it. So that's what this project is focused on. Some other reminders about these rules and how they apply. So as you can see in this image here on the left-hand side of the slide, they only apply to the private lot. So while we do recognize that there's aspects of walkable design in the public realm that are very relevant, this portion of the rules is only focused on the regulations for the private lot. So that's important to remember. We are looking across the entire city. So all the zones, including recent CFA, the overlay, we're looking at all areas of the city and looking at the current zoning for them, except for areas with industrial or rural character. And so these are intended to be design standards that can be broadly applied across large areas of the city. But they do apply to new development or redevelopment. So if there's portions or areas of the city that are not currently what we would consider walkable, those continue as they are. That change is incremental. So this is the state setting a target for incrementally over time getting toward more walkable design. The city of Ashland needs to be consistent with these OARs for CFEC on or before a major TSP update. So that's why we're coming to you now. As you know, the TSP is just starting to kick off. So the city has been looking at its land use regulations and seeing how consistent they are with the OARs. So that's some background. What is walkable design? I think before we jump straight into the code concepts, it's always helpful to remember, what are we targeting here? What is walkable design and what does it mean specifically in Ashland? And, you know, it's each of these individual standards that get at these elements of how one experiences the neighborhoods and parts of your city. It's the building orientation, it's the windows, it's the doors, it's how someone moves through and connects across different neighborhoods, how easy it is to get to transit, how they walk through a parking lot. So the OARs look at this broad segment of all these aspects related to walkable design, but really it's also about reducing personal vehicle use, reducing those climate impacts and making healthier and more connected communities. So it's really, when we say walkable design, the aspects that we're looking at. And DLCD, the state developed a walkable design standards guidebook. As part of that, there's a model code. And Jamin and I were both lucky enough to work on that with the state. And that is a tool that we used in this project and that the state developed, which is a benchmark to explain, again, what is walkable design and how does the city achieve it. And so the city is using that resource and can look at that to determine what are the types of outcomes that the city wants to encourage in order to be consistent with that vision set by the state. So just a reminder of this overall project. We came to you back in February. At that point, we'd done a code audit. So we looked across all of aspects of your zoning code that had relevant standards to those aspects of walkable design I just described. We did a full code audit. We walked through that with staff and we shared those initial findings with you all for your input. And we developed a set of concepts. Then based on those concepts, we've developed a set of draft code amendments, and that's what we're here to discuss with you tonight. And then based on feedback from you and from City Council and additional input from staff, we'll be producing a set of adoption-ready code amendments at the end of June, and then staff will have those to take through the full hearing and adoption process moving into the summer and fall. And as you know, here there's a round of community engagement we've done. We have put out, the city helped, we helped the city to put out a series of social media announcements. There's some website content. And it also went out in the city newsletter announcing some background on this project. So we did a round of outreach, and I want to share what we've heard in terms of input that we took as we developed these concepts that we're going to share with you tonight. So first, we reached out to a series of local climate and transportation advocates. So we met with members of Southern Climate Action Now and Streets for Everyone, and we presented the project to them and walked them through the concepts to hear some of their key priorities. And so I want to share those with you tonight. They wanted to emphasize that while Ashland is a walkable place, the city should always be committed to doing more and being better to ensure that this neighborhoods, sidewalks are accessible for everyone to use. And a key aspect of walkability is not just building design, but also landscaping and green street trees that really make Ashland the type of place it is. There's also a lot of points brought up about the solar orientation code standards. And so several participants felt that that may take precedence over walkable design. So for example, a home that was oriented such that it could get that solar power was more important to have that orientation for the solar than it would be to be oriented to the sidewalk to create some type of more walkable environment. So that's the input that we heard from them. And I believe we've provided notes for all of these stakeholder meetings that staff can provide if there's any interest. We also held a outreach session with local developers and builders as users of the code to try to get some sense of any concerns or areas that they supported of these code amendments. So we shared with them the draft code amendments that you're seeing tonight, and we got their comments on them. They had a ton of information about the details and the ins and outs of the code, but some higher order points that they made are that their preference is that the code remains more simple, not more complicated. And the more complicated it becomes, the more that they need to figure it out, seek to understand it. They need to take the time to submit more complicated applications. And they feel that those rules may make it harder to design and build, particularly housing. So that was a key point of feedback. Lastly, I just want to share what we heard from City Council. So we're going to walk you through the same set of slides really that we shared with them. We presented the code concepts, and we had a very lengthy discussion about each concept, but there were some overall higher points that came out from that. So I'm going to explain the must-have, nice-to-have sort of options here. But in general, council felt that there was a policy preference for having less regulation, doing the things that the code audit found the city is not consistent with the OARs, and doing just that, but not necessarily going further to address additional aspects of walkable design that the city may do. And that really was related to those development concerns of making it easier for development, not having any impact on project cost, and really getting out of the way of the private market. And there was a feeling that without those regulations, restricting or explaining specific ways to get to walkable design, they felt that the market would produce those elements anyway, so that they weren't really a necessary add to the code. There was one exception to that, which was there was support of this design standards that I'll share with you tonight that are related to multifamily development and that ground floor design of multifamily buildings. So several councilors did feel that it's important to get that aspect of Ashland right. And as there's higher density, larger projects, particularly in the CFA areas, there was a desire to think maybe a little bit closer about those design standards in areas that are targeting really higher walkability. So I'm going to pause there. That was a lot of information, and I'm just going to see if any of the commissioners have any questions or comments that they wanted to raise before we walk you through the concepts themselves.
Looks like everybody's good. Oh, no.
Okay.
Russ has one, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation so far. Just a quick question. I noticed that there's some community engagement left to do through June, and I was just curious, what have we not seen yet?
Yeah, I think the intent there is to just share additional updates on the project website. And also originally the project scope was developed with the thought that these code amendments that we're discussing with you tonight would be adopted in tandem with the climate friendly areas. And so therefore there would have been more information to share because these would have been further along toward the adoption. But I think that's also a question left up to staff in terms of how they want to circle back and provide additional detail in terms of the timing of when these amendments would be coming forward.
Fantastic. Thank you.
So I think that Pauline was correct in looking at summer and fall for adoption-ready documents to move forward to the Planning Commission for consideration and the City Council for decision. As far as additional public engagement, I think that would be isolated to the public hearings revolved around this particular item. We're not planning any additional open house or other engagement. I would note that Derek has developed a city website or webpage on our website that proliferates information, and we'll continue to keep that updated and do a social media post as we get closer to having adoption-ready documents so people can see how they might impact them to be prepared to present at those public hearings.
Great. Thanks, Brandon.
I think we're back to you.
Okay, great. So I'm going to walk you through now the code concepts. Before I do that, I just want to remind you all about the code audit findings that we shared last time we came here in February. And I share that to say that generally we found in looking across large areas of the code that Ashland is not only consistent with the OARs, but it also goes above and beyond the model code, which really is the benchmark for walkable design. So the concepts that we'll be sharing with you tonight are limited in scope in that the city of Ashland already regulates a lot of aspects of walkable design. There's some of these examples here, such as requiring buildings to orient to the street, encouraging the use of alleys, discouraging and regulating drive-through uses, requiring streets to connect at a larger network scale. And then also there's several special districts that really go quite a ways toward regulating walkable design. So there's many aspects of your code that are already regulating walkable design. As we conducted the code audit, we looked at Rule 0330 and the model code, and then we compared your land use code, Title 18, to those. And we looked for consistency. So where we found that a standard in Title 18 was not consistent with the rules, we've noted that as the city must update that standard in order to be consistent. If a standard in Title 18 was consistent with the rules but not consistent with the model code, then that's a choice. The city may choose to update that standard to go further and be at the same level of the model code in terms of encouraging walkable design. So those are the concepts that's the structure of the concepts we're gonna walk you through tonight. You have a copy of that discussion draft in your packet. And this question came up at council, so I just wanna clarify for you all that the version of the code that you're currently looking at includes both those must-haves and nice-to-haves. And one of the questions that council had asked is if we could make it a little bit more clear in the code draft itself, but I'm going to try and elucidate that for you as much as I can this evening. So I'm going to walk you through 4 different concepts, and these are areas where the city of Ashland could consider zoning code changes to encourage walkable design outcomes. And those are apply more design standards to single family and duplex uses, reduce the visual prominence of garages, require ground floor residential uses to be pedestrian oriented and activate the sidewalk, and require more windows and weather protection for commercial uses. And I did want to share that I think whenever we're looking at design standards, whenever a city is considering these, it is a balancing act. And keep in mind that there are a balance between those design outcomes that you're seeking, that placemaking, high quality, walkable design with project cost feasibility. So I think it's important to keep in mind balancing out which standards, how many, how complex they are, and keeping in mind those different points as you're trying to make a decision. So the first concept, and I'm going to pause after each one of these concepts to take questions. So the general structure of these is I'm going to present one slide. That's the concept that shows what we found in your code. And then I'll have a second slide which walks you through the concept of how to update that. So in your residential zones currently, the code audit found that there were no standards requiring entrances facing or oriented to the street. And so that was inconsistent with the rules. And so this concept is proposing that the city must update the code to require that standard. But to go further, additional transparency standards could promote more eyes on the street and a more engaging design. So you see this type of design would be an issue with that, right? There's not that transparency, there's not that engagement or interaction with the street here. And one part of the OARs calls out specifically to have additional design standards that promote sociable development patterns in residential neighborhoods. So this concept is looking at how to promote more sociable development patterns in residential neighborhoods. So the standard that you could see in the code, but here simplified for you, is requiring a minimum of 15% of the ground level wall area of walls within 30 feet of a street lot line to be transparent. And this is specifically being applied to single family and duplex uses. And so the questions are, should the city choose to apply this additional transparency or nice to have standard? And a finer grain detail here is, should the code require transparency standards on both sides of a corner lot? I'm going to pause and see if there's any questions and then take comments.
Russ?
Yeah, thanks, Vice Chair. I guess my first question is for staff. Are we seeing a lot of residential out there in Ashland that does not meet this 15% minimum?
Yeah, Derek works in current planning, may be able to elaborate. In general, because we don't have a standard, we wouldn't have been tracking projects that meet or don't meet over time. I think generally market forces are such that buildings do have a primary orientation to the street, and, you know, with some exceptions, generally we see a lot of craftsman style housing development, historically compatible development, and those have those elements built in. But Derek, you can.
Yeah, I mean, as Brandon said, we're not, seeing calculations for the percentage of window transparency, but my sense is that more often than not, houses are meeting the 15% and have a door facing the street. It's just, it's not a requirement, and we do have rare instances where somebody has a door you can't find.
Yeah, and thanks for that, Derek. And I've kind of cruised around Ashland over the last week, and what I noticed is that it seems like most houses in Ashland meet this threshold. I guess, yeah, I'll leave it at that for a second. Thanks, Derek.
No. Oh.
Thanks. Could you go back to the previous slide and expand a little bit more on how you think the must-have, the second bullet point there? It looks like it has a door facing the street. Does it need more windows?
Yes, thank you for clarifying that. So this is would not meet the transparency standard. It does meet the entry standard.
Okay. And those are interesting. They have lots of windows towards the ball field that's on one side of it and towards the mountains on the other. So the quality of living is pretty nice with the window orientation, but in this standard, I could see how it didn't meet the 15% then on the windows facing the street side.
Thanks. Thanks for, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I have a question regarding what the exception to that standard would be. So is there a process articulated wherein if, let's say an architect is designing a home, the client really doesn't want a lot of transparency to the street, but they want openness on the sides, kind of like this example. what's the exception process or the waiver process to the rule?
So I'm going to ask for staff's help a little bit in answering this question. This question came up in council as well. There is an exceptions process, but not currently for the single family and duplex uses because those are allowed by right. So I don't know if Derek or Brandon, you could jump in and provide a little more information on that exceptions question.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point in that because single-family homes do not, or duplexes or homes with ADUs don't require a planning action, we do not have currently in our code an exceptions process to apply to building permits for single-family homes. Other than in the case of if a single-family home didn't meet lot coverage, we would direct them to apply for a variance to that standard in order to turn it into a planning action. So I don't think that is the intent of an exceptions process, to have that high a bar. So in the event that exceptions were to be considered, I think we'd have to develop a pretty clear and objective determination as to under what circumstances. And Derek, if you...
And then my follow-up to that is, then what's the enforcement standard? So if a designer, if a developer violated the rule and there's no process on the front end to getting approval, then what's the enforcement piece on the back end?
I would note there would be a process on the front end prior to construction on either the building of a new
Right, the
building
building
requires a
permit.
building permit, modification of the front facade to add a window or remove a window. You know, if there was an existing building, removing a window, that may not trigger a building permit. And as such, that would be a question for code enforcement for subsequent violation.
Okay, thanks.
Eric?
Thanks. And then I guess on the 15% windows facing the street, I guess I would also question, what if you live on the corner? Is that two sides?
That's what they were, yeah.
Both sides of the house, you need the windows on the street side?
Yeah, I think that's a question. I think the
Yeah,
city,
it is.
It is, yeah. I think the city could choose, and that's one of those balancing points, right? The city could choose to apply that standard to any of those, either of those facades facing the street. And that would get you to that higher transparency and maybe that walkability goal. But it is asking more of the development of that house. So that's one of those policy choices.
Sure. Go ahead.
Thanks, Vice Chair. You know, in Ashland, we want to be walkable. We also want to be affordable. And so my next question is, would there be added time or cost for staff to review calculating window treatment on how do you say it? Facades?
Typically, when there's a code requirement, that burden falls to the applicant to present in the building permit how specific standards such as the solar standard are met. I think that they'd also have to provide a calculation showing how a transparency standard was met as part of that application. The additional staff time to review that is rather de minimis, just going through the checklist and saying that it's met. It could probably become more timely in the event that it wasn't, and then the iterative process to work with the property owner or designer to make those changes.
Thanks, Brandon.
I have a question, and this is probably stupid, but since the state is requiring all of these things to be included in the design standards, why wouldn't they become part of the building code? Just like electrical stuff is and plumbing fixtures are. And
That might be a good question for our consultant team who have worked with the state. I think generally the building code is fire, life, and safety issues. And design
Instead of
elements
social
of a land
issues.
use are more not necessary in order to protect the safety of the occupant.
But the minute you put a must on it, it is. It
We
changes.
also have, lot coverage requirements. They're not covered under the building code.
Right.
They do have to
Okay.
meet under the land use code.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd say that, this is our interpretation of the state rules. The state rules don't explicitly say that every city must apply a minimum transparency standard to residential development. But there are broader rules and guidelines that are expressed by the state in those administrative rules that Pauline cited that speak to design standards such as this being included. So this is our interpretation of what we think is consistent with those rules and is consistent with the model code that the state sponsored to develop. And so there is some flexibility in what the city must do, but this is our recommendation for we think is what is consistent with the intent of those rules.
Thank you for that clarification. So it's not really a must. This is the way to achieve one of the goals that we must respond to.
Yes, there are some, when we say must have, the transparency one is that's why we classify it as a nice to have. There are some design standards that are more clearly articulated in the rules as being required. And so having entrances that face the street are read of the rules that is more directly required by them. Transparency is also consistent with the intent of the rules, but is not as explicitly required. And so that's how we've tried to draw that delineation between things we think the city must have to demonstrate consistency with the rules and things that would bolster your case are the nice to haves.
Thanks. I just lost my way for a moment. You already said it correctly the first time. Thanks. Anybody else? Okay.
Perhaps Brandon, a question for staff is if there's a need to get a sense from the commission where they fall on this, or if we should just continue to move through each concept and cover it and take any questions or comments. Could you maybe perhaps clarify that?
Yeah, I mean, I can leave that to the vice chair in terms of whether you feel that it would be incumbent upon the commission to provide a thumbs up, thumbs down for particular nice to haves. It might be informative as we move forward to drafting adoption ready code. The same said, it would trigger a public hearing process. And so it's evident that could change as well.
Well, it seems to me that we could. And I surprisingly feel like I'm against it just because I think it happens anyway. And it's social engineering. So anyway,
Yeah.
I don't.
And I will note it's a study session, so there's no expectation that you would make any binding decision.
Right.
I think it's more of the nodding of heads that would help provide guidance as to, is this something that we should look at incorporating or not?
Okay, so can we have a shake or a nod?
Can I just, one other
Yes,
quick question?
please.
Thank you, Vice Chair. So I think, to Russ's point, it's hard to argue against walkability. I mean, I think walkability is probably a key driver of why people love to come to Ashland, why they like to live in Ashland. I guess I can't help but think that maybe there's a quantitative basis somehow to help make the decision and the trade-off of various code amendments where you look at the cost versus the benefit. And I would agree that, from an economist standpoint, you would let the market decide, and the market would probably, I think if a developer was also weighing in, they would say, look, we build toward buyer expectations and market demand. And in most cases, that produces what you see. So anyways, I don't know if there's really a question, but did you consider is there a way to develop a kind of cost-benefit analysis to some of these code amendments?
I think there is. It wasn't specifically in our scope of work and would require more research and analysis than really possible for us to provide at this stage of a project like this. I know that other cities have commissioned that kind of study or analysis in order to inform their decisions on this. So I will say that the transparency standard that we've recommended here is not uncommon in many other jurisdictions across the state. And as was noted before, many existing houses that are being developed in duplexes would likely already meet this standard. So my hunch, and I should say it's a hunch, is that this doesn't add much to the cost of development, incremental to what a developer would already provide. It does provide some certainty to the city that this transparency, benefit towards walkability would be provided. So that's my hunch, and also in my recollection from discussing these kinds of standards with developers and other projects around the state. But we haven't done that quantitative kind of cost benefit analysis.
One thing just to interject on this cost benefit analysis component, one aspect of many of the walkable design standards, and the transparency I think is central, has to do with having defensible space in the community and having eyes on the street, which is not a tangible monetary equivalent as to what that value provides back to the city. So this is one of the areas that the council had requested that we reach out to members of our development community to determine if they can provide a generalized cost benefit analysis in terms of many of these nice to have amendments. So we do plan on doing that, and I should have addressed that when Commissioner Phillips requested information about other public engagement. That is pending, that we're hoping to do before it comes back with adoption ready. I don't know that we'll have a dollar for dollar assessment of how much additional costs, because there's so many variables that impact individual building development.
Thank you, Brandon. Anybody else have anything? Yes, Russ.
Yeah, thanks, Vice Chair. I guess I would just add that, since there's a tangible benefit to walkability, and it doesn't seem like that there's a decrease in affordability, I would generally be in favor of this.
Okay. And you were in favor?
I agree.
Eric?
I'd be against it. Energy efficiency, you don't know which way the house is facing. There's architectural features that are done based upon energy efficiency or solar exposure. Also, too, it doesn't really help if someone's building a house and they don't, a lot of houses in Ashland, mine included, sit down below the street level, and then you have eyes in your house all the time, unless you build some type of cover where that can't be done. We have streets like Weimer and Church that are so noisy, no one walks on them, and people have better views in other directions. So they might want a little bit of the sound barrier with smaller windows, at least, not even just less, but smaller windows facing that street side. So those people would be hindered without even a consideration for quality of life or an architect doing the best design possible for the house and that exposure. And it doesn't help if someone's worried about that they have their blinds pulled up all the time, 7 days a week. We've missed the opportunity there of eyes on the street. So that's my opinion.
I tend to follow the market forces argument, which I think is similar to what Eric is poking at. So I think there's value in transparency and attempting to set a standard. I think there are a lot of circumstances where you might not want to follow the standard, which is why I was asking about exemptions and enforcement earlier.
Thank you. Everybody, can it be in the code as we'd like to see this instead of as a actual?
We've taken a lot of pains to remove a lot of sections of codes that were guidance as opposed to actually code requirements. What we have done is prepared guides, and I think that are informative to people as to, historic preservation guides, ADU design guides, these kind of things, which are not code required, to shift things out of a clear and objective code and put it into more of a guidance.
Yep, so I think I already was clear, but I think it's an unnecessary requirement. I think front door facing the street is great, but.
Great, I appreciate all that feedback and the different viewpoints. I'm going to move us to the second concept. So also in that residential zone context, our code audit found that Title 18 was missing standards that limit the width of garages as a proportion of the overall building facade. So no limitation on how wide that garage can be as a proportion of the whole width of the building. And also it was not prohibited to have garages that extend beyond the front facade. So we've identified those as must-haves. And then an additional nice to have to consider would be an additional setback from the front facade. So there's allowing the garage to sit flush with the front facade. But then this standard would actually require the garage to be further set back from the front facade. And I'll show you an image of that in a moment to help clarify. And then additional standard looking at if there were more than a 2-car garage, any additional garage openings would need to be set back to reduce their prominence. So it would not be as wide and as prominent a garage. So this concept is looking at different design standards that could emphasize the living spaces of homes over those vehicle serving areas, so that as you walk down the sidewalk, you'd have a different walkable experience.
Can I just add one more thing there? Yeah, just more on the general intent behind these kinds of regulations on garages. The problem we're trying to address is that when that garage is projecting out in front of the house, and any garage is particularly wide, it's both that the blank wall and the monotony of the wall along the street is not very interesting for a pedestrian. So from the perspective of creating a walking environment that's interesting and comfortable, garages such as this image don't do a lot to support that. But also it is related to that same idea that Brandon alluded to, related to visibility of the public space on the street, and that if the garage is extending out in front of the house, it's going to block some of that visibility from where the people are inside of the house looking out onto the street, and providing some sense of safety and security for pedestrians, that space is being watched in some way that would make people feel more comfortable spending time there. So those are some of the bigger ideas behind why that's related to walkability.
And so the policy choices here, so the standards that you have in the draft discussion code are a requirement that a garage entrance not be closer to the street lot line than the front facade, and that the maximum allowed width of a garage opening be 22 feet or 50% of the width of the street facing facade. So a limitation on how much space the garage can take up in the facade, and also a requirement that it not be the most prominent visual element that extends out from the front facade. So the questions or the policy choices are if the code should go further and actually require that garage to be recessed, and also looking at the code requirement for the additional recess for third or fourth garage stalls.
This kind of goes back to the last point I made. This design standard seems great when we're down here on this flat land, but you get back up to Weimer, and there's only a small amount where someone could even pull into their into their driveway, their house sits way below the road. So on a lot of these hillsides, you have to have, your garage is the only thing that's on street level. Everything else is down. And then the back of the house obviously drops off quite a bit with decks and multiple stories. But a lot of these properties, if you were to put your garage behind the front of your house, they wouldn't be able to even have a garage. So there needs to be a big exception if this is something we want to do for hillsides. Also, too, we have we have a lot of these secondary streets that maybe have 3 or 4 homes off of it. And is that kind of street standard considered here too? Because some of these houses are oriented to the side of that road. It's not a pedestrian busy road. There might be 2 or 3 houses on that road total, but due to the orientation and the lot, their street frontage might just be the side of their house due to the way that the neighborhood was designed. And I think we've had some of those in front of us before.
Then there's how to transfer it to flag lot rules too. Same thing.
Yeah, exactly. I think this is I agree with Eric. I think this is a good example where a guide is more appropriate than a stricter code, if you will. And I think really, to Eric's point, the site will drive access, what you can practically do. And so I would put this more along the lines of developing an effective guide.
Thank you, Vice Chair. I think the tricky part on some of these is the point that Eric made is that you look at, sort of standard generic vanilla case for a particular street, and obviously one is more attractive, but like my garage sits entirely in front of my house. I have a downslope. There would be no use of having 15% of, transparency in my front house. It would have exactly the problem you described. So it's a diverse landscape.
If I can get clarity from Pauline, my understanding is that the must-have includes that the garage and the face of the building being flush is the minimum standard. What was being discussed is the nice-have of requiring the garage to be further recessed than the front facade of the house. But under the state rules, is it not the case that you cannot have a code that allows the front of the garage to be closer to the street than the front facade of the house?
That's correct. So the must-have would be precluding garages extending further from the facade of the house.
I would add to that some of those situations that you mentioned where, particularly on hillsides, where it would not be logical to try to arrange the garage to be either even flush with the facade or recessed from the facade. I do believe those are instances where either the code could outright exempt houses on a certain slope, potentially, or those would be good candidates for that exceptions process. So I think as we're presenting this code language now, it does appear to be pretty universal and would apply in all of those instances, but there are ways to write the code so that it applies generally, but there are some outright exceptions or modifications, particularly on sloped lots where this gets more complicated.
In the cases of a P&E or a hillside lot, I mean, if you can prove that putting the garage where you need to put it creates less disturbance on the lot and all those other factors, then, so that would just have to go with this, is that.
Yeah, that presumes that the project has physical environmental constraints.
Right, it does.
And is going before the city or planning commission. In many cases, the siting of a property is on lands that are at 23% and therefore not triggering it, which may have the same issue in terms of garage placement.
So it needs to go beyond the P&E, but I'm just,
Yeah.
that way of being able to get around the code
Yeah.
It's a disturbance factor. Anyone? I guess we're silent.
All right, I can move us to the next concept. So this is looking at ground floor residential uses, which has become more relevant, particularly as the city has looked at its CFA overlay, but also I think as cities continue to grow with more housing units and meeting that housing demand, more different types of housing, there's a greater amount of residential development that's foreseen in the city. And so this is looking at the design standards applied to that ground floor. If you look at the current standards, and I should just say this is a nice to have, this is a walkable outcome with buildings up close to the street edge. However, it can result in the current code as applied in a somewhat blank or uninviting streetscape. And so to the point that one of the commissioners raised, this may be a situation where people have their window shades down and there is a window, but there's no real interaction or engagement that activates that street or makes it an interesting place to walk by. And really the intent of these walkable design standards is to create environments that are engaging where someone would choose to walk by them and prefer that as a way to move through the city as opposed to driving their vehicle. So we looked at, and we've provided in the draft discussion, one option, which is a standard that has two different components to it. So the first is requiring more frequent entries for those ground floor residential uses. And the thinking there being that those frequent entries are going to activate the street in a way that we would typically see in cities active use, requiring commercial uses on the ground floor. This code standard instead requires frequent entries. So that same component of or intent of people coming and going to activate the street. And then also looking at that transition from the public to the private realm. So I'll go into those in a little more detail on the second slide, but that's the general idea or concept here. And I do want to note that I know that there have been a lot of discussions around the CFA overlay and making exceptions for, requiring commercial ready spaces. And so one thing that we wanted to take into account is not applying these design standards for ground floor residential uses such that they would be in conflict with that intent of having commercial ready spaces. So there was a desire to not adopt standards that would preclude a residential space from being turned into a commercial use in the future. So I want to keep that in mind and provide an exception there for this. So this is looking, this design standard for ground floor residential uses is first requiring that a minimum of 50% of dwelling units on the ground floor that abut a street lot line have a main entrance that can be accessed from the public sidewalk or a courtyard, or so there would be entrances, let's say, along the back of the building. So this is really just looking at the building facade along the street. So requiring some percentage of dwelling units along that street line to have those entrances. Every so frequently, every 50% of the overall units have to have those entries so that there's that activation of the sidewalk. So that's the first question, is if the city wants to require those individual entries. And then this is getting at the building design of that ground floor. So requiring those entrances to be set back between 5 and 10 feet so that there's an area of transition between the public and the private realm, and provide at least 2 design treatments to help with that transition. And so here's some examples of the types of design elements that could be provided. And those are intended both for the person who's living in that space to create a little bit of separation from the sidewalk, but also they, again, provide that interesting and engaging sidewalk experience. So it's a complicated concept, so I'm gonna stop there and ask for any questions or clarifications.
I'd just like to, the slide you showed before, that is showing what you don't want to see.
Yes, this is, yes.
But if some of
I should
those, like
clarify,
if some
this
of
is
those,
showing- oh,
I'm sorry, if some of those were doors, like those windows that are narrower that go all the way, so from an affordability standpoint and maybe from a design standpoint, that's the kind of building that somebody that's trying to not spend a lot of money would probably create. The other one, which of course is much more desirable, is also much more expensive for the entry to the building. So I'm just struggling with requiring a developer to do that and adding the cost to those ground floor units. And even though I would love to live, if I was going to live on the street like that, I would rather live in the other. Please.
Thank you, Vice Chair. So coming from multifamily finance, I've seen a lot of this type of project and a lot of projects in between that are trying to accommodate the general goals which you are putting forth. Obviously, the trade-off is if you want more housing, and you don't want to have ground floor retail requirement because you give up units that you would otherwise be able to provide to the public. The other issue is that at least in certain municipalities, the ground floor retail is a loss leader for the developer. I mean, it's at cost, or sometimes it's even subsidized in certain cases, or it's empty. And we have cases of ground floor retail here in Ashland that are empty and have been empty for months. So if there's not the market demand for the commercial ground floor, then I'm not sure it's that much more attractive. It's just an empty space. I think it would be helpful in this case to see the myriad examples of accommodations between this garden entry that you show and this flat entry, because there are developers throughout the Pacific Northwest that are trying to accommodate this pretty successfully with small porches and entryways and balconies and all sorts of stuff. That's it.
Thank you. Anybody else? Greg?
I would add that for me, it's balancing the concept of walkability, which is good, versus the market forces that drive what's affordable, and then the design forces and that relationship between the designer and the client that drive what the client wants. And I'm not suggesting the client would want this over the other, but that's also a function of budget. And so I lean toward, this being really driven by the market.
Russ?
Yeah, thank you. A question for staff. I'm just trying to envision this here in Ashland. Could you give me a few examples of spaces where these types of buildings could be built?
So multifamily development standards apply in R2 and R3 zones. The most recent larger scale project we had was at 188 Garfield Street with 78 units. The most recent project that the Planning Commission reviewed was at 210 units at Highway 99. So those are larger scale multifamily. In those cases, there was orientation to the street for 188 Garfield, but it's a slightly different model in terms of different market, in terms of who it's being built for. The case of the project at Highway 99, those buildings are pretty far recessed from the street and received exceptions to some of the orientation issues because of the distance. So unfortunately, we don't have a lot of examples. Derek might know North Mountain is probably a good example of adaptive commercial space. If you go to the, forgetting the name of the particular subdivision, that
North Mountain Square, Fair Oaks
Thanks, yeah.
Court, where Carlotta's restaurant is, right across from the North Mountain, Mountain Meadows. You see that is about 33 units, and the ground floor are allowed to be commercial or residential. And they've kept those commercial ready And it is interesting to feel when they're occupied by residents without any sort of transition, just a storefront window that they put blinds on. If for those of you that were at the Planning Commission retreat a couple years ago, we had night nurses who were renting one of those spaces come out and yell at us to be quiet because we were treating it like a commercial streetscape instead of their front stoop. 880 Park Street, the corner park in Siskiyou, is another example of recently done multifamily. Those have individual entrances to Siskiyou for each of, there's 15 quad units, and all the ones in front on Siskiyou have individual entrances with stairs that relate pretty well to Siskiyou.
Yeah, thanks, Derek. And I think in my mind, where this is most interesting is undeveloped commercial land. So when I try to envision a building like this going in, and it develops into residential, and then at some point it wants to redevelop into commercial, and we have a building like this that's supposed to be commercial ready, is this what we want the commercial landscape to look like?
Yes.
What's the apartment building that's fairly new? It's on Siskiyou. The backs of the apartments actually face Siskiyou. They have, I think they have patios, but they don't go all the way to the street. I think they were built in like the last 4 or 5 years.
That's not park and system.
Yeah, the only
It might
ones
be-
I can think of are park.
Is that the back of the units though?
I don't know how
The
they relate
face
to units.
Siskiyou?
They do have entrances to the street. They might be a back patio, but
Do
it's a
they?
stairway up to a seating area and a door.
Okay. Okay. So then it would comply with what we're trying to achieve
Yeah.
here. Gotcha. Thanks.
Well, it's interesting. It reminds me of a design concept where, like in a lot of small towns in Italy, the villas actually turn their back on the street. The street's pretty walkable based on scale and everything else, but the house or houses, create a sense of a courtyard within and literally turn their backs on the street. So interesting counterposition to this.
I think it's the scale of the street. I agree with you. They're like all over Mexico. But it's the streets are smaller, softer. I think we're not providing you very clear responses. Sorry.
Well, we're also not sensing a lot of enthusiasm about this kind of design standard, so that's a helpful direction for us. If there's anyone that's quiet now but has some enthusiasm for this, that would be helpful. But it doesn't sound like there is.
I would love to see that. I mean, I don't see the feasibility of requiring it. That's all.
There is one way to try to thread the needle here between allowing the market to operate and to maybe set some additional standards, which would be not to require those entries, but if those entries are provided, then to require some kind of design treatment to make sure they're successful in terms of relating to the street and providing that kind of interesting and active space that you see here. So that's one option that would preserve some flexibility. It would still mean that if a developer chooses not to have entrances that open onto the street, then they would not be required to meet these standards. So they'd be far less effective in terms of their impact on new projects. But it would provide some guidance and some ability to require something when the developer has chosen that they're going to provide entrances onto the street.
I was going to point out another way to sort of thread the needle would be that while the city is required to look citywide and across zones, it's not necessarily required to apply the standards citywide. So I do think also if the city felt that there were key corridors where this type of outcome would be particularly desired. I think that is another option where these would be applied in a really targeted way. So I'd throw that out as an option to consider.
Thank you, Vice Chair. I think you really hit the nail on the head. I mean, I think it's really the setback that is the trade-off and the effective compromise, because you get the ground floor units, you get additional housing, but you provide some level of buffer between the walking area and the living area. And I think market forces will determine whether that should be, landscaped or a low fence or patio or whatever. But I think it's really the setbacks that's the trade-off. That's my only comment.
Thank you. Okay.
All right, I'll move us to the last concept.
So this is a fairly targeted, this is looking at the design standards for commercial uses. So the code audit looked at Title 18 in terms of design standards applied to commercial uses and found that there were several, but there were limited transparency and weather protection standards being applied. So what you see here is today what's required by the code, which is that a minimum of 20% of the ground floor wall facing the street must be transparent, and that there must be weather protection provided over entries. And just to clarify, that 20% is not by the store face, but it's along the entire ground floor of the wall that's facing the street there. So one potential consideration that the city could have here, which is a nice to have, is increasing those requirements for transparency and weather protection. The intent there being that, again, more windows along the street provide more opportunities for views into the space as more interesting to walk by. And the weather protection over can really provide in all sorts of weather, whether it's a very hot day and you're trying to escape the sun, or it's rainy, or there's snow, that weather protection can really improve the use of that sidewalk. So we're looking at, I have a suggestion here to look at a minimum of 40 to 50% instead of the 20% of the ground level street facing facade being transparent, and then weather protection being provided along 50% of the length of the ground level facade. So I'm going to see if there's questions or comments related to if that transparency is something desired to require, and also if expanding the amount of weather protection is something that the commission is in favor of.
So I like the weather protection idea. I'm not a huge fan of the transparency idea, and I think what comes to my mind is the old adage that form follows function. And so if I was had a commercial enterprise that was let's say a small IT startup, and I was doing some like a small mini cloud, and I didn't want or need windows. If the function of that enterprise didn't really want to have windows, then I shouldn't have to have windows. If it's a function that benefits from transparency and letting light in, then obviously, that's a different market driver or aesthetic. So I would say form follows function.
I just respond to that. One thing to keep in mind with these kinds of design standards is you're applying to a building that buildings last,
Right.
50, 75, 100 years, and the internal use or the function can change quite a lot, especially for a commercial building over that time. And I think even when there are windows provided, many uses that would prefer not to have as many windows figure out ways around that. And so from the perspective of sort of setting up that building to be more walkable, if there are those kinds of uses that want that transparency, that's sort of the idea behind requiring more of it, is that over time the uses may change, and at one point there may be a use in that space that doesn't want the transparency, and maybe they put up frosted window coverings over part of the window, which is common to see. But during, maybe that use changes at some point, and there's a use that would benefit from having that transparency, and now the building is set up to provide for that over time. So that's sort of part of the idea, is that uses can change, but the building will stay for quite a long time.
Yep.
The ones that I struggle with are the ones that are just like this building. It's on a corner, and that might be a pretty valuable wall, on the side street there, whatever that street is, for a retail space, or if it's a restaurant, people to sit there. So it might be, I see the value in the windows and in the exposure. But if you're on a corner, that really limits what you can do in that space. And then my only thing is I like the weather protection. However, I think there should be a maximum, because sometimes I walk downtown and you're only walking under awnings and you don't see the sky. And it's like, or you, in your last presentation to us, you showed some examples of weather protection where they had used some thick glass as part of sitting on a structure. So at least you got the light through there. In these awnings that are installed a lot around downtown Ashland, they go down so low, they protrude out further than the picture you're showing here, but they do cut off a lot of the exposure to the building. It's what worked and what was cheapest in the 60s, but we have better designs today. And so that's something I would encourage you to look at, is make sure that if there's weather protection, somehow we still get light and sky through there for 50% of it.
And as I'm relating to this, I think that there's some justification for assigning things based on street classification. So if you do this just by zone, you're going to end up requiring a lot of transparency on streets that could have commercial development but don't have, there's no need for them to have that level of transparency or weather protection. So if there's a way to relate it to street class, I think that would make it much more valuable. Yeah, Eric?
Is this where I could also bring up a gripe about code enforcement with the mini mart kind of situations? We have these signs, they have windows, and all we see is just signs of Monster and Red Bull and pens and I don't know, it's getting a little out there in Ashland. That hasn't always been that way. So hopefully if they have windows, they aren't covered up with a bunch of signs for cheap disposable things.
I think we're good. Thanks.
Great. So just quickly touching on next steps. So the consultant team and staff have heard now from both Planning Commission and City Council, and we're going to continue to review that feedback and also continue to have review of the draft code that you see across different relevant departments to also get their input. As Brendan mentioned, staff is going to seek to reach out to developers to try to get a better sense of some of the cost implications to provide some of that information. And then we'll be taking that input, and our team will be finalizing a set of code amendments that are adoption ready to leave at the end of this project with staff, who will continue to bring those to you for additional feedback and final adoption. So appreciate your time tonight and all of your input. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for the presentation. That was really good. Yeah. Yeah.
So I have a recommendation in terms of the agenda for commission's consideration. In the interest of time, we do have both the discussion on the transportation system plan public engagement, but we also have a public hearing for the employment or the economic opportunities analysis. And as such, if there was interest, we could move the transportation system plan to your next meeting in order to afford the applicant or the consultants from CAI an opportunity to go over their work on the EOA.
How does everybody feel about that? Good.
Yeah, I thought it was really packed when we looked
Yeah,
at it
great.
earlier today.
Yeah, it sounds good to me.
So with that, I can start with some introductory remarks that this public hearing concerns planning action PAL-2025-00017. That's a legislative proposal to adopt the City of Ashland's 2025 economic opportunities analysis as a technical support document to the city's comprehensive plan. As the consultants will undoubtedly mention, the EOA is a state-required technical study prepared in accordance with Oregon Administrative Rules 660-009-0015 and specifically statewide planning goal 9, which focuses on economic development. So I wanted to note that this document as presented doesn't create any new policy or regulations. It does establish a factual basis for future land use decisions, economic development planning, and strategic goal setting by the Planning Commission City Council. We are introducing again Community Attributes, Inc. It's a consulting firm that's worked through this project and a technical assistance grant from the Department of Land Conservation and Development is assisting in the City of Ashland in replacing our 2007 economic opportunities analysis. And we all know there has been significant changes in Ashland's economy, the state and federal government in the 18 years since that document was last looked at. So this does have new projections in terms of employment trends, land capacity. It's fortunate it's coming on the heels of our having adopted a buildable lands inventory. There is an ordinance that is presented to formally adopt the EOA as a technical support document. And that does require a public hearing both before the Planning Commission and then the City Council. So after which the city could then use the EOA as a factual basis to support future policy decisions. I'd also note that the Department of Land Conservation and Development will review the final iteration of the EOA for compliance with state law, so there is the opportunity for them to have the city make further adjustments to it. So this evening we have a presentation from Chris Mefford and Courtney Sina of Community Attributes, Inc. Thank you guys for joining us. You're also familiar with Elliot Weiss, who's worked on this with CAI. He's unable to be here this evening, but we're in good hands with the remainder of the development team that's been following this project since its inception. I also wanted to note that on the call, Jordan Brooklyn is also present. I believe she's on the Zoom call as a representative from the she's the deputy city manager for the city and here for any questions that you may have for administration department. And with that, I will turn it over to Chris and Courtney, invite them to begin their presentation. Thank you.
All right, thanks everybody. Thanks, Brandon. I'm going to share my screen with everybody here to drive the presentation. Okay, is that coming across just fine? Okay, good. Thank you, everybody. Well, greetings. Glad to be here with you this evening. Elliot Weiss certainly wishes he could, dates would have worked out better for him, but I'm glad to step in and glad to have Courtney Sina helping me as well. Courtney's been closer to the action from a month-to-month basis, so there might be some process or specific questions we can turn to Courtney. We've designed a rather straightforward 15-minute or so presentation. I very much appreciated the way Brandon framed what an EOA is for the purposes of this discussion as a fact-based reference tool for future decision making. And that's certainly the intent, to set the stage for those future conversations. We stop short of making any strong recommendations, but we hope that the data serve up those conversations in the future. So in addition to analytics and pulling together the data from disparate sources, the team has done a fair amount of engagement, including meeting with you all. And some of the findings from those studies are a part of this work as well. So for this evening, we're going to talk through just a little bit more introduction and purpose, share some trends we think are relevant for context. We'll get into the employment land sufficiency itself, the crux of the matter with the EOA, and then we'll frame some of the findings from the qualitative outreach as well. Certainly not enough time to get through all of the breadth and depth of the content that we have pulled together in the report. So I'll cruise through at a high level and make sure we have time for any questions you have that you can either go more deeply into these topics or to go into other areas we didn't get to. Again, as Brandon mentioned, the purpose of this is to set the stage for future conversations. The Oregon law, the statute calls for different ways to frame it, but as we talk about trends in data analytics, the crux of it is to look at what is the forecast of the economy in Ashland and how does that translate into the demand for land, and how does that compare to your land supply. So again, stopping short of recommendations, but to pull that information up to you for future conversations as part of your comprehensive planning process. This really just restates what we've said a couple of times now. The assessment of the community economic development potential at the end there is just one more component of this. Okay, as Brandon said, it's been a few years since you've had this done, so a lot of the data need to be documented to have a point in time that you're doing this. Ashland has grown in population at a rather slow rate, but the region as a whole has only been a little bit ahead of Ashland over the years. Compared to the region, Ashland's population in 2024, the last year for a lot of this data, is a little bit older than the region, a little bit more educated, and a little bit higher concentration of white people relative to people of color compared to other communities in the region. Household size, 78% of the households have one or two people. 45% of households in Ashland are homeowners compared to 61% of the county, and 44% are renters compared to 33% of the county. So the city skews a little bit more towards renters as a result. As of 2023, housing units are a little higher vacancy rate than the county as a whole. 59% are single family, so the above, of course, including some single family renters, but as far as the housing types go, the majority of the houses are single family. Jobs to housing balance, we like as a metric just to understand the degree to which it's a employment center versus talent going elsewhere. Your jobs to housing balance has declined just a little bit. I'd say not enough to think of a big change there, from 0.78 jobs for every housing unit compared to 0.74. It's a little bit lower than the regional average of 0.85 and a little bit lower further still than the state as a whole at 1.08. It's likely defined by relatively skewing older residents in Ashland and a higher share of retirees that are not in the workforce. 37% of your working residents work in Ashland, and the remainder of your local labor force commutes outside of Ashland, likely to Medford and other areas. We've got those details in the report. 31% of the jobs anchored in Ashland are filled by local residents, with the remainder coming into Ashland from elsewhere. The industries that bring in the most people on a day-to-day basis are your accommodation and food service industries, educational jobs, and retail trade jobs. As far as land use goes, you have 17% of your land use in 2024 that is designated for employment uses. 8% is on your employment zoned land, an additional 4%, this is all adding up the components of the 17%, is on commercial land. 1% of that 17 is industrially zoned, and the remaining 4% is made up of your special districts, including the Croman Mill District and the Healthcare Services District. Climate risks include high vulnerability, as you know, with your own hazard mitigation plans, with wildfire, drought, air quality, extreme heat, and earthquakes. Some of these are technical components of the EOA that are required to inform the conversation about land supply. National economic trends, just to put data to what we've all been living, as we move in years further away from COVID, when unemployment rate spiked and the labor force participation declined precipitously at that time. Much has returned to the way things were before, but much is different, of course, with unemployment rate nationwide at 4.1% right now, and the labor force participation rate higher than it was during COVID, but still reflecting a downward trend over time for the past several decades. Inflation has been a big topic, of course, on a national scale. It's been rather steady now for about 9 months. Likewise, the interest rate conversation has been rather normalized for the time being, in a way, for a few months as well. So again, just some broad national strokes for the economy as a part of the EOA. I'm not going to read through all this. We don't quite have enough time, but I'm just going to put some context here. With the region having grown, Oregon's population grew 0.9%, with Jackson County and Josephine County growing a little bit less than that over the past 13 to 15 years. Remote work trends, of course, are happening nationwide, and it changed rapidly during COVID. In your area, you have a larger share of remote workers than elsewhere, down at the bottom left of that slide, with 21% of Ashland's workers reporting that they work on a remote basis compared to 17% statewide. Your top industries in Southern Oregon, defined by Jackson County in particular in this case, are sporting goods manufacturing, healthcare services, and food and beverages establishments. That's using location quotients, which reflects the concentration of the economy, plus a notion of growth, how that has grown since 2010 in this case. A very common way to look at which industries are growing and how they rank relatively within the economy. In addition, for total employment, some of this I think you've seen before. We were grateful for Brandon prompting us to look a little bit further into jobs. I think when last you saw this, the questions around the Southern Oregon University came up. And let me turn to my notes, Brandon, that I emailed you earlier. Certainly education is a part of your local economy there. We found approximately 650 jobs in total at SOU, 150 of which are instructional faculty, and an additional 500 or so that work in administrative or other capacities on campus. The school district has another 400 or so for Ashland School District, so that ranks pretty high. Employment data are tricky to pin down. There's different definitions of it. This slide here, which is also in the report, refers to a source from the U.S. Census Bureau. We call it LEHD, or loads is the other dimension of this. For some communities, we don't love that data source because it doesn't line up well with other data available by the state. In your case, these numbers tend to triangulate rather well compared to state data sources and other employment sources. So we can get really wonky and nerdy on this stuff to get into the definitions, but this table fits rather well with the data we found, especially as we looked into the Southern Oregon work. That educational services number up there actually is in the ballpark of what we'd expect, having done that additional research. We also did custom forecasts that are an important part of the work, and we'll touch on that in a minute as well. Down on the lower right, it shows which industries we think will continue to grow. Those lean heavily on established regional forecasts from the state of Oregon. So our work, our value added, if you will, was to look at the local trends in Ashland compared to the county and the region, and to compare that to the state forecast to come up with what we think is a plausible forecast for Ashland. And it's adding about 1,400 jobs in the end is what we're using to drive the demand for land. Again, we'll touch on that in a minute. You pick up the pace here so that we can get through in a timely manner. Citywide retail rates have gone up and down, of course. Right now, retail rates are leasing for about $17 an hour. It's less than it was pre-COVID, but it has gone up mostly since the COVID recovery. It's down a little bit in the past year and a half or so. Vacancy rates reflect that, having been higher at the peak of COVID and dropping and going back up. A lot of the challenge with Ashland economic data, as you all probably know, as a smaller economy and a smaller town, one development can change things a lot. Any individual expansion can show up in the data. And so to do trend line analysis, you have to factor in a lot of ups and downs from historic data. Industrial leasing and vacancy, industrial lands make up a small part of your local economy. But again, to document the state of those markets for your EOA this time around, you're at about 27% of vacancy rate for industrial land, which is relatively high. It has been quite low off and on over the years. And then all it takes is a couple of large format employers to change the amount of space they're using there for that number to spike up. And rents have dropped accordingly at $10 a square foot. Housing, you are the blue line on the right. Lots of ups and downs on a cyclical basis each year, but trending rather similarly to the state as a whole. You are a little bit higher than Medford, a little bit higher than the county as a whole. Many of the housing prices as a whole have stayed rather flat since COVID, with that volatility on a month-to-month basis within the years or within any given years. So nothing dramatically changing there to affect how we would look at the overall economy driven by housing prices. But this not being a housing study, we didn't get into the details there, so please forgive me if I'm glossing over some of the nuances, because I know housing's high and it's important for that to match up with the workforce needs. Okay, the crux of the OA, as we mentioned, is to look at land supply and to compare that to the demand of forecasts. You can have conversations about future land uses and zoning considerations. We rely heavily on the work you've already done with your own buildable lands inventory. We translate the employment forecast, like I said, to give you an input for what the long-term demand for land might be. When we go back and forth with that, and we think about things like size and variations to help you interpret that information. We found, pulling information from your buildable lands inventory, that you have had 181 acres of net buildable employment lands in 2024, and our forecasts add up to a gross total of 76 acres. So, we can't match it up too precisely to dial it in terms of which of those 76 acres makes sense and how does that compare for your overall net supply compared to the demand. But that is a significant of enough delta that the forecast that we're able to derive would imply that you have a surplus of available land for the overall growth trends. And we'll talk about that in a minute as well. So our estimate is you've got 100 acres of additional land more than the trend analysis would suggest would translate into a demand for employment land moving forward. This ignores, or it doesn't ignore, but it leaves out the public sector demand. So by statute, any expansion of institutional growth from your school system or the local governments or county governments, and this includes the university as well, is not included in the demand. Now, any ancillary demand around the university that would be picked up because of activity in restaurants, cafes, coffee shops, and things, or any services businesses, those would of course show up in the other employment forecasts. But the employer itself, as Southern Oregon, as a public sector institution, is not a part of the analysis. And again, that's per the statutes of the EOA itself. So even though those gross numbers would imply there's a surplus, that doesn't mean that all of the sites are perfectly well suited to accommodate either the growth that is going to happen or the growth that you might wish to happen. We certainly know of the mill site, and I believe there's a healthcare campus as well that has some capacity there. Those may or may not be all you need and want in terms of large format employment, large parcels for larger employers. So our analysis doesn't get into that detail of matching up what you want for economic development opportunity compared to the size of the parcels that you have to meet the EOA requirements statistically. And as that reference document that Brandon mentioned, we simply set the stage with the math that says, yes, overall there's ample supply, but as you get into the comprehensive planning conversation, there might be aspirations to do economic development for larger footprint employers that may not match up to the specific parcels that you have. So we don't claim for this analysis to be the end all to be all for the specifics of what you want. And again, as a smaller community, that's a particularly sensitive topic because in a larger community, there might be more opportunities for parcel aggregation and for some of the for something surprising to be able to be absorbed in the trend analysis. We get into, as I mentioned, some of the larger sites just to talk about. The Corman Mill and the Railroad District in particular offer the largest contiguous development opportunities. The opportunities to enhance visibility and access amongst the E1 areas and downtown are important. Downtown, of course, being a great attraction asset to the community. There may be some individual opportunities that can improve things for any one project opportunity, some of the devil in the details, if you will. And finally, just to touch base on the inputs through the different focus groups and outreach that we did. That was a fair amount of the work the past few months. I think some of this information you've received in the past as well. Did some interviews and focus groups, including some of yourselves. We did a survey of residents and businesses across Jackson County. We did some work in tandem with the city of Medford to take advantage of the timing with both Ashland and Medford in that regard. Some of the feedback we got out of that effort, tourism ranks high, both of interests to diversify the Ashland's economy, both for businesses and residents. They very much like the idea to leverage assets such as a recreation plan to work proactively for challenges like wildlife, smoke, and the rising cost of living. Businesses express a challenge of inflation, finding qualified employees, and rising labor costs. That's very common across all communities in the U.S. Barriers to accessing Ashland's many amenities exist, especially for younger and economic disadvantaged families and individuals. Cost of living is the primary barrier. Other opportunities and priorities that came from that outreach: student retention with that talent base at SOU. Students express wanting to find more ways to integrate within the community that they can afford. So more ways to cater to the younger folks that are coming out of that is an opportunity. Development hurdles, while there is support for growth that honors Ashland's identity, the feedback from the development community is that there is difficulty in developing. I will note that just about every economic development plan we've ever done has included the development community commenting on wishing for development to be a little bit more friction-free. So your version of that is your version, and that's not to discount that at all, but I also don't want you to feel called out in that regard, because it is a common topic with economic development. And finally, downtown, great asset. A lot of people wish to talk about that as a part of Ashland's future. Bend, Oregon comes up often in those conversations as a model that they'd like to see the city look closer toward. And finally, to wrap up, I guess I've got this and then just the next steps. I didn't go into detail here. Each of these 6 themes are identified and built out with the notes from the outreach that we've had. But to frame everything we've spoken about so far in the presentation here, we've distilled that down into 6 strategic themes that you might wish to consider as part of economic development planning in the future. One is to strengthen economic resilience through diversification of your economy. 2 is to foster an inclusive and forward-looking community. 3 is to unlock the potential of local talent and institutions. 4 is to make space for business growth, and that's the physical space we're talking about. 5 is to leverage and build regional partnerships to scale impact locally. And then 6 is to activate Ashland's lifestyle advantage. So, there's always open for wordsmithing those, but those were the 6 themes that the team analyzed in parsing out the qualitative outreach that was conducted along with the data. And finally, as Brandon mentioned, we will follow this presentation with a presentation to the City Council on June 3rd. I believe Elliot is planning on being there in person for that one. We have an equity and inclusion self-assessment work to work through with you, make some recommendations for the updated economic development to build on those themes as well. Because this is tied to a grant from DLCD, we are under a little bit of a time crunch here. All the materials must be complete by the end of June. So that's the presentation. I guess, Brandon, I might turn it over to you to say if there's anything that I glossed over too quickly, or if there's anything that you wish to shape differently from how I presented it.
I think that was pretty complete. I'm going to steal Brandon's thunder. Thanks so much. I mean, that was a lot to go through.
Sure, thanks.
So do we need to vote on accepting this, or what's the process?
So this is a public hearing, and so the commission would need to open the public hearing, although nobody is in the audience to speak, and we did not receive any advance testimony, and then close the public hearing, and then make a motion related to recommendation to the City Council on the EOA and the accompanying ordinance.
Thank you. So I'd like to open the public hearing, and now I'm going to close it. And then we need a motion.
Are we able to ask questions, or that
Oh, yeah, we
opportunity
can
passed?
we can discuss.
Oh, okay, because they presented before, I wasn't sure if questions were closed. Questions aren't closed?
No.
I just have a few quick questions. So I know that Soretti publishes it's out, One Rogue Valley Economic Plan for Southern Oregon. I'm just curious if you consulted that document?
Yeah, early on in the process,
Okay.
we met with them, we talked with them, we looked at that plan.
And this is just more of a detailed question, but is there some kind of multiplier in the algorithm of jobs to commercial land availability? I just can't help thinking, having an economic background, that it's going to vary by industry, and that would impact your ultimate quotient for the available commercial land.
There certainly is, and in the report we get into the detail where it's not a one-size-fits-all approach across different industries, but the forecasts are driven on an industry-by-industry share with a different employment density assumption that, like I said, it's not one-size-fits-all, but there is that metric of the jobs per acre that we've varied based on each industry. And there are a lot of good data sources in Oregon for that. The state of Oregon actually publishes guidelines with that as to help guidance for all the EOAs, but then we did our own analysis based on the data that the city gave us to triangulate with that as well, as an input into the demand forecast.
Great, thank you. Last question is, and this might have come up the first time you presented, does the study incorporate like the renovation repurposing of existing commercial space to meet the demand for projected employment growth?
That's a great question. No, it doesn't get into the redevelopment. The assumption methodologically is that we're looking at net growth and those net impacts. So there is room for redevelopment to live within these forecasts and increase the density with that. With that redevelopment would say that's maybe, if you will, even a more conservative understanding of how the planned supply would accommodate the growth.
That's all, Vice Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Russ?
Yeah, thanks, Vice Chair. Thank you guys so much for this. I think that this document is going to be really beneficial for our city for a long time to come and be helpful for us to make a lot of big decisions. Let me preface this question with, it doesn't change how I feel about this, but it just came up to me. It occurred to me to ask the question during the presentation, and apologies if you guys have already gone over this, but the Croman and Railroad property, they're currently not build ready. And so I'm just curious what percentage of our buildable lands are wrapped up in these two properties, as they don't seem to be current opportunities for the city.
Right. Well, the time frame for this forecast is a 20-year horizon, right? So there can be a lot of variability within the growth spurts and the availability. I don't know that I can answer on the fly here the percentage, but if that's helpful enough for you, that's, I think, an important component for it.
I can't answer percentages, but I can give you acreages and how they relate to the surplus. The railroad property, the area that had environmental contamination, was 16 acres in size. The Department of Environmental Quality has indicated that the cleanup of that site, they've already received the work plan for the cleanup. This is subsequent to the remediation plan that this body saw early. That is expected to begin the work on cleanup after fire season this year. The Croman plan is area of the former mill site is 61 acres in size. And there were 3 areas on that property, cumulatively probably 5 to 10 acres. I haven't seen an actual assessment of the areas of contamination, but so you could presume that even though they're not ready to develop in the sense of having all infrastructure in place, that would be developer driven as proposals came in for 13 acres on the railroad property and 50 acres or so on the Croman site. The remainder, once cleanup is completed, would be developable as well.
Thanks, Brandon. Yeah, super helpful to hear that in context of the analysis, so appreciate it.
I'm sorry, I lost question.
That's okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was at Chamber Luncheon last week, Travel Medford presented. Did you see there's the projected growth in sports tourism in Southern Oregon? Did that come up in your research and data? I know Medford's been like fast tracking a lot of hospitality, and there's this growth in hotels along.
Yeah, absolutely. No, we saw it in a couple of ways. One is the way you mentioned at the end there, where it's just one more driver of tourism, right? So it's just one more component of visitation to Ashland that sustains the tourism industry and the hospitality industry, which, as we note in the report, is one of the big drivers of growth. As far as sports tourism goes, it's an interesting industry because the employment side of that might be spread out and quite dispersed, and how that translates into a demand for employment land other than hospitality. It's a real mixed bag, right? If you've got people that are coming to Ashland to mountain bike or to hike or to camp or to golf, the jobs tied to that are either in the hospitality industry, or it's uncertain how it translates into a footprint of how many jobs on a per acre basis with those individual businesses. And they might darn well exist outside of Ashland, but people might come and stay in Ashland as they partake in that outside of the city.
Great, excellent.
Any other questions? Anybody ready to present a motion? Eric? No? Russ?
I make a motion that we adopt the EOA.
Roll call? Oh, sorry. Second?
Second.
Can I make an amendment to that? I think that the amendment would be that the Planning Commission recommends to the City Council that they approve Planning Action PA-L-2025-00017, adopting the 2025 Economic Opportunities Analysis.
Sounds great.
I'll second the amendment. I thought, yeah.
The amendment seconded, we're now back to the original motion, which presuming it was a rearticulation, but you still have to vote on the original motion as
With the
amended.
amendment.
Yeah,
Okay.
sorry.
So, yes.
Commissioner Perkinson,
Aye.
Commissioner Herron,
Aye.
Commissioner Phillips,
Aye.
Commissioner Marr,
Aye.
Vice Chair Kincairn.
Aye. Are we done?
Yeah, so our next step will be to bring this forward to the city council on June 3rd
Yeah.
with your recommendation. So thank you. And thank you, Chris and Courtney,
Right.
for joining us this evening.
Yeah, good job, thanks.
Thank you. I couldn't hear Brandon, but I think I read the body language and the gesture, so I appreciate it. So
I
thank
was
you.
gesturing to the screen. Thanks for you and Courtney for being here this evening.
You bet. Thank you all. It's a pleasure to work with you. We'll
Good
be in
night.
touch.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Well done.
Do I need to move to adjourn, or can we just adjourn? What's the rule?
I typically would do a motion to adjourn
Oh,
and
okay,
then
thank
adjourn.
you.
That's how.
So would anybody like to move to adjourn?
And we also have the potential for other business on the agenda. So that was the one item that if any commissioners had other business.
Is there any other business any commissioners would like to bring up, or staff? Yes?
Just a quick question here. For planning actions, this is a question for staff. Does ex parte begin when the notice is given, or does it begin when we get our packets?
So thank you for, first of all, giving me that question in advance, knowing that it would come up under other business. The application in terms of ex parte contacts, as soon as we have a complete application, so that is essentially if somebody submits a complete application, we take 7 days to review it at the staff level. If it's complete, we send out notice to the neighboring neighbors as well as any other party of record. At that point, if the commission has a contact from somebody, even though you've not received your packet as of yet, that would constitute an ex parte contact to disclose at a subsequent meeting. To your point in terms of, is there a way for the commission to be made aware of applications filed? We can certainly let the commission know when, the planning commission know when type 1 or type 2 or type 3 planning actions are filed. Many type 1 actions never come before you, but they do have that potential. So there would be the ex parte. So I think that what we can do is we can work internally about adding to our notice where we notice the neighbors to send a notice to the planning commission and inundate your email box with, probably a dozen or so that you won't actually end up seeing each month. but may be informative nonetheless.
Yeah, thanks, Brandon. I think the intention here is that I would hate to accidentally have ex parte contact on something that I didn't know that was coming before the commission.
Appreciate that diligence. I would note that an ex parte contact is not a fatal flaw in the process by any means. If somebody catches you in a grocery store line and continues to bend your ear, even though you've indicated that you can't hear it, all you need to do is disclose that I had a conversation with, Mr. Smith, who indicated that he was opposed to this action, and I still feel I can be a fair arbiter of the decision, and you've resolved the ex parte contact. The same is true for reading a newspaper article, reading something that you weren't aware, an email that you received before getting halfway through it that was about an action that's coming before you. It's just a matter of disclosing that for transparency.
Thanks for the clarification, Brandon. Appreciate it.
Would anybody like to move to adjourn now?
So moved.
Second, as long as Greg still has his left arm.
Done. Where was that building?
That's not so scary.
Well, where?
Right past the one.